When an account is created in Decisions, it is created with password authentication. This means that when the user logs in, they will provide a password to the Decisions server. If the password matches, they will be authenticated and can log into Decisions. Okay, you might be thinking, all right, I already know that. But did you know that's not the only way Decisions can authenticate? Welcome to Decisions Account Authentication. In this video, we are going to be going over how to set up single sign-on within your Decisions environment. Now, this is a pretty involved topic, so we are going to be going over the primary steps necessary to set this up and not necessarily every single setting possible. Additionally, the enabling of single sign-on also requires the creation of an identity provider. These identity providers are, provided by third parties and therefore not part of the Decisions application. So we will go over the settings in Decisions, but not how to create this identity provider that you'll need. So, with those disclaimers, let's get right into the video. So the first thing to note is that single sign-on works a little bit differently than native account authentication. The account exists in the Decisions database, but it is not authenticated through Decisions anymore. Rather, the identity provider will do the authentication. This works by a user making a request to the Decisions server, and that Decisions server will then make a request to the identity provider. That identity provider will either authorize or not authorize based upon their own credentials, whether that is biometric data, it can be a password, it can be whatever that identity provider uses for authentication. Once it gives that the all clear, it authenticates through the Decisions server and the user is allowed to log in. Sometimes the user has already been authenticated through that identity provider in another website or server. So therefore, when the Decisions user visits Decisions, their account will already be authenticated, and they will not need to perform that process again. That is one of the key highlights of single sign-on as an authentication method. The overall process for setting up single sign-on looks kind of like this. Step 1 is you need to configure the identity provider. If there is no identity provider to connect to, you can't authenticate through single sign-on. Secondly, you want to configure Decisions to handle the authentication through this external identity provider. This typically involves installing the SAML module, connecting with the identity provider using credentials and certificates and other information that we'll discuss in more detail in a moment. And sometimes you want to configure a SAML login flow, which will allow users who are logged into Decisions through the identity provider to have specific actions performed on their account, perhaps maybe sorting into groups or maybe directing them to a dashboard or adding information from their login to the Decisions platform. Thirdly, you need to configure the accounts. The accounts themselves have to be enabled to use single sign-on and be enabled to use your specific identity provider. You want to make sure that the proper security groups have permissions to be able to connect to where they need to in the Decisions environment from the IDP, or identity provider. So, let's go into that first step. Now, creating the identity provider itself is outside of the scope of this video. We are not going to be going into how to do that within the external service or maybe internal service that you are using to connect to Decisions. That being said, a few things you want to take note of are 1, whether the users are in the proper security group in order to be placed into the proper group in Decisions, and 2, what the naming policy is, because you will need this information to accurately link the accounts in the identity provider to those created in Decisions. Going on to step 2, the next thing you want to do is install the SAML module into Decisions. This can be found underneath the security folder and then by selecting identity providers. Now you may need additional modules installed, such as the OpenIP or Okta Connect module, which are both located in the same place. This is going to depend on which identity provider you are using. Once you install the module, you want to navigate to the SAML settings, which will be a new settings that appears under the settings folder in Decisions. From there, you will check the enable box, and then after you have checked that, you will see the option to add an identity provider. There's a lot of information you have to provide in order to connect properly. Now, not all of it may be used, depending on which identity provider you are connecting to, but a lot of it is mandatory. Now, these credentials are going to come from your identity provider itself. However, a few that I can give you some tips on would be the following. First of all, the login URL you can expect to be from your identity provider. The logout URL is going to be the single sign-on provider's logout URL, which may be the Decisions one or it may be external. This does not have to be from your identity provider, but it can be. You also need a 509 certification, which authorizes this call to the identity provider from Decisions. And you also need metadata, which ensures that the proper details of the account and the provider are transferred correctly to the Decisions environment. This will be either a document, a URL link to it, or the static code for it itself. There are a few other features that you will need to configure based upon your identity provider settings. That is where you will get that information. Thirdly, you need to convert the accounts. Now, when an account is made in Decisions, as already mentioned, it is password authenticated. You would be best setting up a flow that changes those accounts from password to SAML authentication. You can also reach out to support at Decisions.com for such a utility flow that allows for this conversion. Please note, once you convert the account to SAML, it will no longer be able to log in via Decisions natively, even if single sign-on has not been configured yet. And while you go ahead and start creating the accounts, we do recommend leaving at least one account as a native admin password login in case anything were to happen with the SSO provider and you need to log in Decisions in a hurry. This will allow you to access Decisions even with SSO enabled. There is an additional step you need to take in order to allow this native login, which we will go over in just a moment. But the last thing I want to mention is that once you have everything configured, you can then change Enable Single Sign-On from false to true in your Settings.xml, found in typically your C drive or Opt drive if you are in a container setup, Decisions, Decisions server, and then look for the XML in there. Once you enable it, you will need to restart the Decisions service in order for the effects to take place. Now, I mentioned that you could still log on even with a native account when SSO is enabled. That is by bypassing the single sign-on login by indenting the URL with the following string you see here highlighted in red. By adding this, you are taken to the native login screen that users can then access who have native login, such as the admin users, if they need to still sign in natively. Now, keep in mind two particular things with this. First of all, even if you add this additional path to the URL, if you are trying to log in with an SSO account, it will fail on this login screen. Secondly, this is a feature you can disable if you don't want any users having access to this login page. But the way to do that is beyond the scope of this course. So, that's the basics. Let me give you a quick demo on how you set this up then, if you'll follow me. All right, here we are inside of my Decisions environment. So, the first thing that we are going to go to is the Security tab, and underneath of it, we're going to select Identity Providers. Here, you will see that I have the SAML module already installed. So here, you can see the SAML module. You also have access to the Okta module and the OpenID module if need be for your particular identity provider. Once you have enabled at least the SAML module, you will have the SAML settings available within the Decisions settings right over here. I am going to enable this, and as you can see, I can now select a primary identity provider once we make one. So let's go in and I'll show you how to put this stuff in. The display name literally does not matter as far as the API call, as far as the metadata transfer or any of that is concerned. All this is for your viewing of the identity providers you've set up. Selecting the metadata is important. Sometimes you can call it from a URL based upon your identity provider, or maybe they have a file that you can download, or you can just write it all in text, which is an option. The login URL will be taken from your identity provider. This identity provider should have a URL that users are directed to that allows them to authenticate with whatever setup the identity provider has. Whether it's a pinky promise, a handshake, a password, biometric data, whatever it may be. The logout URL can be from your identity provider, though it is possible to list it as decisions and have them log out through decisions instead. Your SP issuer / entity ID is commonly from decisions itself. Typically, it's the decisions base portal URL. However, you will need to confirm this, depending on your decision setup. This is the name ID policy, what links an account from decisions to an account in your identity provider. You can think of this as kind of like a primary key from one table to another. What you're going to match these results by so that the accounts match. You can select email, transient ID, or persistent ID. Typically, email is the go-to, but there are some setups that may require one of the others. The authorization here is going to also depend on your identity provider, and the 509 certificate will need to allow you to authorize with that identity provider so that the authentication can be done through the identity provider. Here's where the SAML login flow is to create an account if a user is not found in decisions. So, let's say that you import a user from your identity provider and the user is not found in decisions as a native account or as an SSO account. Then it will create the account for them through this flow so that the user can still log into decisions with their identity provider credentials. And that, after being set up, will then populate this drop-down to select the identity provider that you just entered. After this is done, you will need to convert the accounts to SSO, which once again, we recommend reaching out to support@decisions.com for a utility flow. Though the primary thing that you are doing is just ensuring that the authentication method, as well as any particular user IDs, which I will show you in the account settings real quick. This user identifier is populated if need be based upon your identity provider settings. After all of your accounts have been converted, barring your admin native account that's used in case of emergencies, you will then alter the Settings.xml line, enable single sign-on from false to true, and then restart your decision service. From there, SSO will then be enabled, and users with proper SSO configuration should be able to log into decisions through single sign-on provided by your identity provider. And that is the basic process for how you set up SSO in decisions. Thank you very much for watching. We hope it helped.